Hello again. My name is Subhas. Um, in today's lesson, we are going to talk about the rook moves. Right. So a rook. White has two rooks over there. Black has two rooks over here. And the rooks can only move in a straight line. It can either move forward, backwards, or sideways, all in a straight line. Okay, right. So if I actually pretend for some reason I manage to get this rook over here, okay, so what will happen is this rook can go forward. It can go as many squares as it wants, depending on the squares available for it to move. Okay, for instance, if this is the rook's turn to move, so it can actually move one square or two square. Okay, so take it back to its position. It can move backwards one square. It can't go any further because there are pawns blocking it from moving any further. Its own pawns blocking it, so it can't move any further. So put this rook back here. It can move sideways. Okay, now it can move one square, two square, it can move three squares or four squares. Okay, similarly on this side it can move one square, two square, or three squares. So it can move over there, so you can move over there, you can move this way, you can move this way, you can move this way. So as you can see, it moves in a straight line, forward or backwards or sideways. Okay. Right, so that's the way. So it's actually moving across the squares, moving across the white or light colored square, and or across the or the dark and the black squares. Okay, so that's what it does. It moves across squares. Okay, that's important. So it moves straight line. Okay, so obviously, if as I said, if let's say it wants to move backwards. It can only move as far as that. It can't move over there because its own pawn is actually blocking this rook from moving. But it could move as far as that, but it could go even further. It might decide to go further where its opponent's pawn, a black pawn, sitting over there, and because it's going to occupy that space, it's actually taken it, it's cut it. It's actually cut it, it's taken it over there, so it's actually taken the pawn back. Okay, but obviously any of these pieces can take this rook if it's the black's turn now. Okay, but we'll talk about it at the latest in the future lessons. Okay, so that's how a rook actually moves. Okay, so if I put the rook back over there, right. But remember, I said that a rook isn't able to move if its path is blocked by its own piece. Okay, and let's say how I'm going to bring this rook, or this black rook, or this black rook. How am I going to do that? I have to actually create space for the rooks to move. So if I do want to move the rook, and let's say white, as normally white moves first in a game. So if I want to bring this rook out, first I got to move this pawn out of the way, and the only way the pawn is going to move out of the way is moving forward. Okay, either one square or two square. So if I move the pawn over there, let's say I move the pawn over there, okay, and from my side I decide to move the pawn right over here, but rather than moving one square, I decide to move two squares. For the very first time this pawn hasn't moved, so if I move this pawn I can move either one square or two squares. Okay, and now then I can actually move the rook. There is a space for this white rook to move, but it can only move one square. Okay, right, it can't, there isn't any more squares for it to actually kind of move to or fly to, because this is in the way. Okay, it obviously can't go this way because there are so it can't go sideways because there's a knight in the way, its own knight in the way. Okay, so it can only move there. Okay, whereas now this side, this rook okay, the black rook has two squares available, so you can decide, if it's the black's turn, can decide either you want to go to one square and then the white moves something else, or you might decide to go two squares, fly two squares. Okay, so it might actually fly there. Okay, so let's say it's actually flew two squares, so one square, two square. Okay, right, now let's say he wants to bring the other square into the game. Okay, though it's the white's turn to move, so you decide to move two squares. Okay, right, now it's black's turn to move, and I still want to move, let's say, this rook. Now I have a choice of actually going back. Remember, you can go forward or backwards, always in a straight line. So you can either go fly back one square or two squares, because those squares are empty and it's available to them. Alternatively, this rook can now go out into the open. You can fly this way. You can fly into any of those squares that are actually available. Okay, so let's say, for example, I might actually want to fly this rook over there. Okay, right. Now, let's say it's white's turn now, and he actually does want to move this square, this rook, over into this square, but this square is being blocked by its own pawn. So you got to move this pawn out of the way. So let's say you decide to move this pawn. It's going to be moved for the first time, this pawn. So you can decide to move one square, two squares. Decide to move two squares. Okay. So now it's actually the turn of the black rook. Okay, it decides to move straight on, and let's say it decides to move over there. It can move as far as that if it wants to. It decides to move forward, so it goes two squares, flies up to two squares. Now what actually happens then is, let's say it's white's turn now. Well, it is white's turn now, and this rook can now go to this square. Or it can go back. It can decide to go back to this square for some reason. Or it might decide to go sideways and to this side. This is as far as we go. It can't go over any further because its own pawn is blocking it. So it can't go sideways any further. It can go only one square sideways. Okay? Right. Now let's say for some reason, what happens is it decides to, it's black's turn now. So there's a black rook there. It actually says, well, okay, I'm going to fly this way and I can take this pawn. Remember, normally if you had a black pawn, its own pawn over there, this black rook cannot go up there. It can only go up there. If, for instance, there's a black pawn, it can only go as far as there. Okay, but in this instance, we got the white pawn there. Okay, this rook actually wants to get the square, so he's going to cut it. The only way he can go to that square, he's going to cut it. So he goes there, goes across these squares, and he's going to cut it, and he's going to take this pawn. Right. Okay, now it's white's turn, and look what the white can do. White got two choices about taking this black rook. Okay, and you can either take this black rook with this pawn, because it's diagonally touching each other, so it's white's turn now, so you can take it this pawn. So you could take it like that, cut it like that, and take this rook. Alternatively, it can the white side could actually use his or her white rook over there, and remember it can go forward if he wants to fly forward, and it can go fly, and then it reaches the spot, and because it's an opponent piece, it can actually go and occupy the opponent's piece square, and by doing that it actually cuts the piece and lost the rook. So there's two ways of doing it, alright? So if I put it back in there, so the white has a choice of either taking the black rook with this white pawn, or I could take this black rook with this particular rook. So let's say you decide to take it with the rook. So there you are. Okay, right. Now actually what happens is, and now this decides to move over there. Okay, for some reason it decides to move, this pawn decides to move, for the very first time it decides to move 2 squares. Okay, and then what will happen is this pawn will actually, it's a white's turn now, the white pawn will actually take this pawn because it's diagonally touching each other, decides to do that. Can just ignore it if he wants to, but it decides to take the pawn. Okay, now it's black's turn. The black will now let's say wants to play, bring this rook out to play. The only way it can do that at the moment, it can't actually move to any of the squares sideways or forward here. So it actually decides to play this pawn, opens up this pawn, so you can open up the squares for this rook. So it decides to go, rather than one square, it decides to go 2 squares, because it moved for the very first time, it decided to move 2 squares. Right, now what actually happening is, it moved 2 squares, and it decided to say, okay, if you don't move your white rook at some point in the game, then I will probably take it. Okay, now this rook, so I don't, the white side says I don't lose this white rook, so it might decide to actually go back. It may decide to go back 1 square or 2 square, or it might decide to go back this way. Remember, a pawn cannot take a piece which is straight, only diagonally, so it might decide to go up there. Okay, or it might decide to go back, or it might decide to go this way to avoid being taken by this pawn. Okay, so let's say for instance it decide to go just 1 square backwards. Okay, and now it's black's turn. It can bring this rook out to play now. It can either go 1 square, in which case it can't go sideways. The next time it's the black's turn. Okay, but so it wants to bring a rook to play, so it actually brought it out to this square. Okay, and he has to wait for this next turn to bring it out to play further into the board. Okay, let's say for instance I'm going to move this pawn. Okay, now it can only, because this pawn are already moved, it can only move one square at a time, so it moves 1 square, and it's now threatening this rook again. Okay, right, so now I might actually decide to move this rook, the black rook, over here, because it can go there. It can't go any further because its own pawn is blocking it, so it can go only there. It can't jump over this pawn or anything like that, so it goes there. And then the white side looks for an opportunity and says, the black side has made a mistake by leaving the rook up there. And remember, I can go forward if I wanted to, and I can fly, literally fly. So these are all empty squares. I fly through these empty squares. I hit this square where the black rook is. I can go there and I can take it. Right, so as you can see, that's a rook move. The rooks, okay, so the rooks can actually, as a quick recap, can move forward, backwards and sideways, okay, as long as the squares aren't blocked by its own pieces, okay. But if there is an opponent piece in the way, and then the rook can actually take the opponent piece and place itself on that particular square where the opponent piece was. Okay, right, so that's really is the rook's move.